J-Lo's new song, Jenny from the Block, all about Lopez roots, about how she's still a neighborhood gal at heart. But folks from that street in New York, the Bronx section, sound more likely to give her a curb job than a blow job or block party. The New York Post, we're sorry about that slip up there. I have no idea how that happened, but it won't happen again. And that's your news. And the G Block, as Fox reports this Monday, November the 4th.
Now, the first thing I have to say is it couldn't happen to a nicer guy. But the second is that actually, you know how he says, I don't know how that happened, but I can tell you it won't happen again. Well, actually, we do know how that happened. And that is, it happened just the way I activated those networks before. And that is that block and blow start with the same three letters. Your brain is simultaneously, his brain was simultaneously activating both block and blow and anything else that began with BLO. There was apparently a second network active that was activated by Jennifer Lopez's undulating half-naked body that led to that Freudian slip. And that explains the convergence of those two networks. You can actually produce slips of the tongue like this about a third of the time experimentally. Now, suppose somebody knew how to shape and activate networks in voters. Well, somebody does, and they're called the GOP. And let me give you an example. This is a word that used to be central to what it meant to be a Democrat. This was the term that was used by Thomas Jefferson. It was used liberally by all the founders. But it became associated over a number of years with a number of rather unseemly phrases. So that liberal became associated with liberal elite, big government, tax and spend liberals, cut and run liberals, liberal special interests. All those things became associated because over time they were repeated over and over and over, so that they became, essentially they metastasized from the minds of really brilliant wordsmiths on one side of the aisle into even the
touching me again.
sorry. Must be something unconscious going on. But in any case,
no, it's very conscious.
But what essentially is happening is that those networks have essentially metastasized from the minds of conservative think tanks into the minds of even liberal and independent voters. So just to finish out the network, we've got Volvo driving, sushi eating, latte drinking, godless atheists. There you have it, a liberal. And that's why it has actually been over 40 years since a Democratic candidate for president called himself a liberal. That was Lyndon Johnson in 1964. You'll remember the dodge from Michael Dukakis in 1988 and Hillary Clinton's impressive dodge to say that she was a progressive in one of the debates. The point I want to make is that this is how our minds work. We activate networks, and we do it all the time in persuasion. There's nothing wrong with activating networks. If you couldn't have your networks activated, you couldn't think. And if you want to be persuasive with someone, to come back to the example that Nick gave us at the beginning, that was wonderfully persuasive language and intonation and visual imagery that FDR was activating in people's minds in that talk. And the line between what's propaganda and what's good persuasion is often a very difficult one to draw. There are lines that you can draw, but they're often difficult. I want to show you an example of the activation of networks that I think is one of the two most brilliant television ads ever produced, and this is Ronald Reagan's Morning in America.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago? Now, why was that so powerful? It was so powerful because it activated
multi-sensory, multimodal networks of association that were all congruent with one another. It activated gut-level feelings about family, about marriage, about the generations, about the treatment of older people, about the hopefulness of people. Note that ad is remembered as Morning in America. But the first line is not, it's morning in America, it's morning again in America. It actually has an implicit negative tone to it that runs throughout. He doesn't say we're proud, we're strong, we're good. The announcer says prouder, stronger, better. Prouder, stronger, and better than what? Prouder, stronger, and better than the dark nights of Carter Mondale. But the important thing about this is that's a network that he was activating along with this positive network. This is as feel-good an ad as you can get, but he's making sure that he's making the comparison. I don't consider that illegitimate at all. I think that's simply a brilliant use of activating multiple networks at the same time that establishes what's good about you while trying to establish, you know, we weren't so proud, and we weren't so strong, and we weren't so good before. To wrap up, I want to give you an example of do I have time for one nefarious example? I want to give you an example of where I think the activation of networks is, in fact, unethical, and that is in the term support the troops, or support our troops. The reason why that is a problematic frame in George's language, in context in Frank's language, and you'll see my language about networks, we're getting at the same thing, is that it's essentially aligning two different networks that have nothing to do with each other, just as the war on terror allowed George Bush to align the war on bin Laden and the war in Iraq, which incidentally we have won neither of those. But the war on terror was a very powerful way of framing it. What Support the Troops does is aligns a network about supporting our men and women in uniform, on the one hand, and deploying them to Iraq and keeping them in Iraq. Those things have no logical relation to each other whatsoever, but it has caught the Democrats over and over and over for their fear of being branded, that if we step out and say, I believe that it's time for a responsible withdrawal, or whatever they say, and they actually back it up with a vote, that they'll be accused of not supporting our troops. And just to conclude with a comment that gets to the kind of thing that George is talking about, how do you answer something like this? How do you not repeatedly capitulate in advance? You need to, as George is describing, you either need to be activating an alternative set of networks with a very powerful story behind it, or you need to connect this with something else. And just to give you an example of that, suppose the Democrats had said something like this. They could have done this as early as 2003, but certainly it should have happened in the 2004 election. It could certainly happen now. And it's something like this. Mr. President, you want to know what it means to support our troops? Don't make their families take up a collection for their body armor. You want to know what it means to support our troops? Armor their Humvees so they don't lose their lives and limbs when they don't need to. Do you want to know what it means to support our troops? Don't send them into somebody else's civil war. You want to know what it means to support our troops? Don't send them to war unless you would send your own children. You want to know what it means to support our troops? When they come home damaged, when they come home with their bodies frayed from that war, don't you dare warehouse them with cockroaches in Walter Reed Hospital. You want to know what it means to support our troops? When they come back to the shores that they will never see again, having given their life for this country, don't whisk their bodies in the middle of the night because it's good for PR for people not to see their bodies. You proudly display their flag-draped coffins like every American president has done in American history before you. You want to know what it means to support our troops? Don't you ever write letters to their parents, to their spouses, to their children when they've lost their lives for this country with a mechanical pen. You write it with your own hand so you feel what it means when they've lost their lives for this country. And you really want to know what it means to support our troops? Bring them home.